Chapter 91. The One Big Beautiful Bill Act. The pen felt different this time. That was what the aides would say afterward, in hushed tones, to the journalists they trusted, and the biographers they half-trusted, and the historians they would someday meet at conferences where all of this would be rendered into something cleaner than it actually was. They would say that Donald Trump held the signing pen the way a man holds a deed to land he has wanted his entire life, not with ceremony, not with performance, but with a kind of animal stillness that was, for him, entirely out of character. The cameras were present, as they always were. The cabinet members stood arrayed behind him in the East Room, their expressions calibrated to something between reverence and relief. The American flags flanked him in their familiar symmetry. But in the seconds before the stroke of his signature, Trump did not look at the cameras. He looked at the document itself. Public Law 119-21, which the administration had titled with the kind of unironic grandiosity that had become its signature, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, was, by any actuarial measure, the most consequential domestic legislation signed in a generation. It extended and in several provisions made permanent the individual and corporate tax reductions first enacted in 2017, reordered the federal relationship to Medicaid in ways that analysts at the Congressional Budget Office had estimated would reduce enrollment by somewhere between 10 and 14 million Americans over the decade, restructured student loan repayment terms that affected roughly 43 million borrowers, and folded within its 837 pages a renegotiation of green energy tax credits that the previous administration had installed as the cornerstone of its climate agenda. The bill had passed the Senate by the thinnest possible margin, after weeks of procedural warfare that had consumed the winter of 2025, and left at least 3 Republican senators with reputations sufficiently damaged that their futures in electoral politics had quietly become subjects of speculation in their home states. It had passed the House through a combination of presidential pressure, targeted promises, and what one Republican appropriations chairman would later describe with evident discomfort as a level of involvement from the White House in the legislative process that was unlike anything I'd seen in 30 years on the Hill. Trump had wanted this bill since the first day of the second term. He had spoken of it in the campaign as though it were already written, already inevitable, a piece of paper waiting only for time to catch up with his intention. In his private meetings with House leadership in late January of 2025, he had been characteristically direct. The tax cuts were not negotiable. The Medicaid restructuring was not negotiable. And any member who required convincing was invited to consider what the alternative looked like when a president with his approval numbers among the Republican base decided to take an interest in their primary. The threat was never stated in those precise terms. It did not need to be. The language of leverage, Trump had long understood, operates most efficiently when it remains implicit, when the listener completes the sentence himself and arrives at the conclusion unaided. The political atmosphere of the spring and early summer of 2025 was one of exhausted, uncertain transition. The country had been moving at an institutional pace that felt alternately electric and destabilizing, depending on where you stood and what you had to lose. The executive orders of the first 100 days had rearranged the architecture of federal enforcement in immigration, restructured the relationship between the Justice Department and the White House in ways that career officials found alarming, and that the administration's legal team defended with arguments that the courts were still working through. The Supreme Court, reshaped by 3 appointments across 2 terms, had signaled in a series of decisions that it would grant the executive branch a latitude in regulatory and enforcement matters that previous jurisprudence had not imagined. The Federal Reserve was navigating an inflation picture that had stabilized but not retreated to the targets it had promised, and the long-term interest rate environment was making the cost projections associated with the new legislation's revenue reductions a source of genuine disagreement among economists whose political independence varied considerably. In city halls and state capitals, controlled by Democrats, a posture of organized resistance had developed over the preceding months, partly procedural, partly rhetorical, and wholly insufficient to alter the arithmetic of what a unified federal government operating with a clear agenda could accomplish in the space of a legislative session. The core obstacle was not, as the press had largely framed it, the opposition of Democrats, whose numbers in both chambers left them without the procedural tools to block a determined majority willing to use reconciliation. The real obstacle was arithmetic of a different kind, the internal arithmetic of a Republican coalition that spanned Lisa Murkowski's Alaska and Marjorie Taylor Greene's Georgia, that included senators from states where Medicaid expansion had been accepted by Republican governors a decade earlier because the math of their hospital systems required it, and that was being asked to put its signature on provisions that the urban hospitals of their states had spent the preceding months lobbying against with the intensity of institutions that understood their financial survival was at stake. There were, at various points in the winter and early spring, 4 senators whose votes were genuinely uncertain. There were late-night calls from the White House. There were meetings at the residence. There was one documented instance, reported in reconstructions by 3 separate outlets, and not denied by the participants, in which Trump sat with a senator from a purple state for nearly 2 hours in a conversation that the senator would afterward describe to a colleague as unlike any meeting I have ever had about legislation, because it wasn't really about the legislation. What the senator meant, and what he could not say directly because the president had not said it directly, was that the conversation had been about everything at once, about the senator's re-election prospects, about the political landscape of his state, about the nature of loyalty in a moment when the Republican Party had reorganized itself so completely around one man's preferences that to oppose him on his signature legislative priority was no longer merely a policy disagreement, but a declaration of a kind of independence that came with costs the senator would need to calculate himself. Trump in those meetings did not shout. He had stopped shouting in the legislative context sometime in the first term, after advisers whose counsel he occasionally accepted had noted that senators responded worse to volume than to the particular form of intimate, almost confessional directness that Trump could deploy when the situation required it. The lowered voice, the leaned forward posture, the sense that the conversation was between 2 men who understood the world in ways that the people outside the room did not. "He makes you feel like he's taking you into his confidence," one former senator had told a journalist. And then 3 days later, you realize that everyone in the building had the same conversation, and he told every single one of them the same thing. Mike Johnson's role in the passage of the act had been indispensable, and in the way of all indispensable relationships with Donald Trump, quietly corrosive. The Speaker had managed the House floor with a tactical precision that his critics had not expected, and his supporters had been counting on. He had made promises to members on appropriations that would require future negotiation, had revised the Medicaid language 3 times in the final weeks to hold together a coalition that included rural Republicans whose constituents depended on the program in percentages that could not survive too close an examination, and had in the end delivered the votes. Trump's public praise for Johnson in the signing ceremony was effusive. He called him one of the greatest speakers in the history of our country, which was the kind of superlative that, from Trump, functioned not as a compliment but as a claim, an assertion of credit that positioned the speaker's achievement as something that existed within the president's narrative rather than alongside it. Johnson smiled through it. He had been doing that for some time. The relationship between the 2 men was one of those Washington arrangements in which the junior partner understands that his relevance depends entirely on the continuation of the senior partner's priorities, and in which the senior partner understands that the junior partner knows this, and in which neither man finds it necessary to acknowledge the dynamic aloud, because the silence around it is itself a form of agreement. The signing itself lasted 47 minutes, which was long by any standard, and yet felt to everyone present as though it were happening inside a controlled suspension of time. Trump signed with a dozen pens, distributing them in the traditional manner to the legislators clustered at his sides. He spoke without notes, which he almost always did now, ranging across the history of the tax code, across the failures of his predecessors, across the specific provisions of the bill, with a command of detail that surprised the reporters present, even though it should not have, because the bill had been the central project of his administration's domestic agenda for the better part of a year, and he had discussed its provisions in meetings, in phone calls, in the corridor conversations of a White House that had organized itself around his enthusiasms and redirected itself when they shifted. One moment, small and unrecorded by the cameras because it happened at the edge of the frame, was described afterward by a senior aide who had been standing near the window. When the formal ceremony had concluded, and the room was beginning to shift from pageantry into the mild chaos of photographs and congratulations, Trump stood for a moment looking at the document still spread on the resolute desk. An aide approached to gather it. Trump placed one hand flat on the page, not a gesture for the room, not a gesture for the cameras which had mostly turned away, but something else, something that the aide described as almost proprietary, the gesture of a man assessing that a thing he has built is at last actually built. He just stood there, the aide said. Maybe 10 seconds. And then he looked up and said, "Nobody thought we could do this." And I wasn't sure if he was talking to me or to himself. Nobody thought we could do this. The sentence, in its simplicity, contained the entire architecture of how Trump understood his own history, the long catalog of predictions made against him, the specific pleasure he took in proving those predictions wrong, the way in which that pleasure had never, across decades of accumulation, lost its edge or its urgency. The bill was real now. The signature was ink. The programs it restructured would begin their renegotiation with states over the following months, and the tax provisions would recalibrate the financial plans of corporations and households across an economy that was watching the federal government revise, in one legislative action, the basic assumptions of the preceding decade. Whether the act would prove, in the fullness of time, to be the triumph he described or the rupture that his critics had promised was a question that would require years to answer. What was not in question was what it represented in the internal chronology of Donald Trump's relationship with political power. He had come to the second term, having already proven what he needed to prove about his capacity to win. What remained to be proven, what the first term had left unfinished, interrupted, and ultimately reversed by the defeat of 2020, was whether winning could be converted into permanence, whether the structures of the state could be arranged in ways that outlasted a single political cycle and rewrote the terms on which the next cycle would be contested. The One Big Beautiful Bill Act was, in this reading, less a piece of legislation than a statement of hypothesis, that power, applied with sufficient clarity of intention and sufficient tolerance for the discomfort of others, could produce durable outcomes. The hypothesis would soon face its most consequential test in an arena that no act of Congress could fully control. The midterm elections of 2026, now only months away, in which the fragile arithmetic of the Republican majorities would either validate the approach or expose the precise threshold at which the consolidation of power begins imperceptibly to exceed its own foundations. Chapter 92: Deficits and Expensing. The fluorescent overheads in the cabinet room cast the same pale institutional light they always did. But on the morning of January 15, 2026, something in the room felt different, tighter, more airless, as though the walls had moved an inch closer overnight. Donald Trump sat at the head of the table with a single sheet of paper in front of him, a preliminary scoring memo from the Congressional Budget Office, and he read it the way a man reads a medical result he already suspects is bad. Jaw set, eyes tracking left to right without a flicker one hand flat on the mahogany, as if steadying himself against a swell. The number at the bottom of the page was $3.8 trillion. That was the projected 10-year addition to the federal deficit if the full business expensing provision and the expanded standard deduction were enacted together without offsetting revenue measures. The CBO had not been asked for the memo. The CBO had produced it anyway. A bureaucratic institution asserting, with the quiet stubbornness of a body that has outlasted administrations of every stripe, that arithmetic does not negotiate. Trump set the paper down. He did not crumple it. He did not slide it across the table to Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent with some theatrical dismissal. He simply pressed his palm flat against it, as though the number could be physically subdued, and looked toward the window. Those who were in the room that morning would later describe the silence as unusual. Trump was not a man who trafficked in silence. Silence, in his operational vocabulary, was a concession, a pause that invited others to fill the space with doubt. But for a moment, he simply sat with the weight of what full expensing actually cost when you put it next to every other ambition on the ledger. The border infrastructure, the defense rebuild, the extension of the 2017 individual rate cuts, the political promise, hammered into 10,000 rally speeches across a decade, that he could deliver growth and discipline simultaneously, that the two goals were not in tension, that anyone who said otherwise was an economist with an agenda. The tension was now on a single sheet of paper with the CBO letterhead. To understand why that moment carried the weight it did, you have to understand what the first months of the second term had looked like from the inside. Trump had returned to power in January 2025 with a mandate that felt, at least to him, categorical. The electoral map had broken his way. The Republican caucuses in both chambers were, by the standards of modern American politics, unusually aligned. Not unified in the way authoritarian systems produce unity, but unified in the way a party gets when it has watched its leader win twice and has concluded that the winning is the instruction. He had spent the first year pushing through an immigration enforcement architecture that reshaped the internal operations of the Department of Homeland Security. He had signed executive orders on energy permitting that the industry had wanted since the Obama era. He had begun renegotiating trade relationships with a directness, critics said a bluntness, that made the diplomatic corps visibly uncomfortable. And through all of it, the economic question had been deferred, not resolved. Growth had held. Markets had absorbed the uncertainty, the way markets absorb most uncertainty in a low unemployment environment, with a kind of distracted resilience that flatters whoever is in power. But the fiscal architecture of the second term had never been settled. The big policy choices, the ones with actual 10-year price tags, had been left for the legislative agenda that the White House had named, with the branding instinct that never quite left Trump's operation, regardless of who was running communications, the American Prosperity Package. Full business expensing was the centerpiece. The provision had roots in the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which had allowed businesses to immediately deduct the full cost of qualifying capital investments rather than depreciating them over years or decades. That provision had phased down beginning in 2023, dropping to 80% expensing, then 60% on a scheduled glide path toward extinction. Businesses had noticed. The capital expenditure data from the middle years of the phase down was not dramatic. Economists argued about how much of the slowdown in equipment investment could be attributed to expensing versus interest rates versus broader uncertainty, but the business community's position was unambiguous. Full expensing mattered, and its absence was being felt in factory floors and equipment orders and the quiet calculus of whether to build now or wait. Trump had no ideological attachment to the mechanism of accelerated depreciation. He was not a man who spent evenings reading tax code with genuine curiosity. But he had a visceral, almost physical commitment to the idea that the American economy should be building things, factories, plants, machinery, the visible architecture of production, and full expensing, as it had been explained to him by advisors going back to Larry Kudlow and running forward through the various economists who rotated through the second-term Economic Council, was the lever that made building faster and cheaper. It was, in his framing, permission. It told American business that Washington was not going to make them wait years to recover the cost of investing. It told them the government was, for once, on their side of the transaction. The expanded standard deduction was different in character. Where full expensing was a business provision, complex, discussed in boardrooms and CFO suites, the standard deduction was personal. It was the number that determined how much of an ordinary family's income was shielded from federal taxation before the rates even applied. Doubling it, which was the proposal that had survived the internal White House negotiations and made it into the legislative text, was a direct and legible benefit to middle-income households. It was the kind of provision that showed up as a real dollar amount on a tax return. It was the kind of provision that, if you were running a campaign or building a political legacy, you could point to and say, "This is what I did for working people." The problem was what they cost together. Individually, each provision had defensible supply-side logic. Full expensing could be argued with reasonable empirical support to generate investment that generated growth, that generated revenue, that at least partially offset the static cost. The standard deduction expansion, because it took millions of households below the threshold where they owed significant federal income tax at all, was harder to offset dynamically. Its revenue cost was largely straightforward. Put them together, layered onto a baseline deficit that the Biden years had left elevated, and that the first year of Trump's second term had not materially reduced, and the SIBO's 10-year number was not a projection designed to embarrass the administration. It was simply the addition of large numbers. The Republican caucus on the House Ways and Means Committee had spent the autumn of 2025 in a negotiation that grew, as those negotiations typically do, more complicated with each passing week. The deficit hawks, a faction that had attenuated since the Tea Party years but had not entirely vanished, wanted offsets. They wanted reductions in mandatory spending, changes to Medicaid financing, modifications to the SNAP structure, mechanisms that would let them vote for the tax package without standing in front of their constituents and explaining why the debt clock on the wall of the Capitol had accelerated. The supply-siders, working with Treasury and with the Council of Economic Advisors, pushed back on the static scoring with growth projections that the SIBO's methodology was not designed to incorporate. The argument was familiar. It had been made in 1981 during the Kemp-Roth debates. It had been made during the Bush years. It had been made with particular intensity around the 2017 Act, and it had a frustrating quality for everyone involved. Not provably wrong, not provably right, the kind of economic argument that history tends to adjudicate only after the politicians who made it have moved on. Trump's position in that negotiation was characteristically asymmetric. He was not in the room for the technical discussions. He was, in the formulation one senior official used later, the weather, the condition everyone was working around, rather than a participant in the deliberations. But he had made his preferences legible through the methods he always used: public statements, social media posts, meetings with individual legislators that produced, afterward, a congressman walking out of the Oval Office to tell reporters that the president was totally committed to full expensing, without any suggestion that the president had engaged seriously with the offset question. He wanted the provisions. He wanted them clean. He wanted to be able to say, at the rallies that never really stopped, that he had cut taxes again, cut them for businesses that build things and for families who work. Scott Bessent understood the political geometry better than almost anyone else in the second-term cabinet. He was a man who had spent his professional life in the disciplined environment of hedge fund risk management, where the gap between a story and a number was not a matter of messaging, it was the gap between profit and loss. He had come into the Treasury role with a public commitment to fiscal seriousness that was unusual for a Trump appointee, not because it was performative, but because it was apparently genuine. He had given speeches before taking the job in which he had laid out what he called a 3-3-3 framework: 3% growth, 3% deficit reduction, 3 million new barrels of energy production per day. The framework was aspirational, as such frameworks always are. But it had given him a posture. He had something to defend intellectually, and the CBO memo was a challenge to that defense. In the weeks that followed the January meeting, Besant became the operational center of a rearguard effort to find offsetting measures that could survive the political process. He worked with Ways and Means on modifications to the international tax provisions. He pushed for changes to the carried interest treatment that the private equity industry had successfully defended through multiple administrations, and that Trump himself had periodically threatened and never actually dismantled. He explored with the relevant committee staff what a restructured corporate minimum tax might look like. None of it added up to $3.8 trillion. Some of it barely moved the needle. But the exercise was not simply arithmetic, it was political. It was about giving the deficit hawks enough of a fig leaf to vote yes, about constructing a legislative package that could pass the House with the margins the Republican majority allowed, about moving the bill through a Senate where the budget reconciliation rules imposed their own constraints on what could be included and for how long. The revealing moment in that negotiation came in late February 2026, during a meeting at the White House that included the House Republican leadership, Besant, and Trump himself. A senior congressman from a competitive district laid out the problem with unusual directness. His constituents supported the standard deduction increase, and they had absorbed the rhetoric about full expensing generating growth, but they were also reading the headlines about the deficit, and he needed to be able to say concretely, specifically, what the offsetting mechanism was. Trump listened. He did not interrupt, which was itself notable. And then he said, in the flat declarative register he used when he had decided something, "We'll grow our way out of it. We've done it before." The congressman nodded. He did not argue. The meeting moved on. What that exchange revealed was not recklessness exactly, and it was not ignorance of the numbers. Trump had been shown the numbers repeatedly by people who understood them. It was something more fundamental, a settled conviction that economic growth was a variable powerful enough to dissolve the constraints that static analysis imposed, and that the people who modeled those constraints were, by temperament and training, predisposed to underestimate what a fully unleashed American economy could do. It was a conviction that had animated supply-side thinking for half a century, that had been proven partially right in some historical windows and significantly wrong in others, and that Trump held not as an economic theory but as an article of something approaching faith. Besant, in a conversation with a colleague around that same period, was said to have described the situation with a brevity that captured the tension without resolving it. We're going to pass it. The question is what it does to the yield curve in year 3. He said it without drama. He said it like a man who has done the math and understands that the math is not the only thing that matters, and who has decided, consciously, professionally, with eyes open, to work within the constraints of the possible rather than the ideal. The package cleared the House Ways and Means Committee in the first week of March 2026. The full expensing provision was reinstated at 100%, retroactive to the beginning of the tax year. The standard deduction was expanded by 80%, not the full doubling of the original proposal, a concession to the deficit hawks that was framed publicly as a phased approach with future expansion built into the legislative language. The offsets were partial, real in some respects and aspirational in others, a mosaic of provisions that the CBO scored at approximately $900 billion in savings over 10 years, leaving a net addition to the deficit that the administration's own economists projected would be neutralized by growth, and that independent analysts projected would not. The bill moved toward the Senate floor with the momentum of legislation that has survived its most dangerous passage and now travels on its own inertia, and in the bond markets with a quietness that the administration chose to interpret as confidence. The yield on the 10-year Treasury note had risen 11 basis points in 6 weeks, a movement small enough to dismiss and large enough for those who watched such things with the specific attention that Besant brought to them, to suggest that the people who lend the United States government its money were beginning, very quietly, to recalculate. Chapter 93. Launching Trump Accounts. The morning light came through the Oval Office windows in long white bands, falling across the resolute desk where Donald Trump sat reviewing a briefing memo that had taken months to produce. The words at the top of the first page, "Universal Savings for America's Children," were underlined in red marker, his own hand from the night before. He had circled the projected figure 3 times. He looked at it again now, and felt the same thing he had felt the first time, that this was exactly the kind of thing people said couldn't be done right up until someone did it. The idea had been circulating in policy circles for years. Baby bonds, starter accounts, seed capital for the next generation. Various versions had been floated by legislators on both sides of the aisle, but nothing had ever moved with enough force to become law. What Trump saw in the concept was not just policy but narrative, a way to reframe the entire conversation about poverty, aspiration, and the relationship between the federal government and the American family. Not a handout, not a program, an account. Something with your name on it. Something that was yours. He had spent the better part of 2 evenings on the phone with donors, not asking for permission. He rarely operated that way. He was telling them where this was going, and inviting them to be part of it, and the distinction mattered to him. The men and women he spoke with understood money the way he understood money, as a tool, as a signal, as a story you tell about what you believe the future is worth. Several had committed within minutes. Others had asked questions he respected, the kind of questions that assumed the thing was happening and wanted to know the mechanics. That was the conversation he preferred. The structure that emerged from weeks of internal deliberation was spare by design. Every child born in the United States would receive a federally funded savings account at birth, seeded with an initial deposit drawn from appropriated funds and supplemented by a private fundraising apparatus that would run parallel to the government component. The accounts would be locked. They could not be touched until the child reached adulthood, and when that moment came, the permitted uses would be specific: education, a first home, the launch of a small business. The policy had been engineered to direct money not toward consumption but toward formation, toward the kinds of decisions that determined what a life would look like over the long arc. Trump called it the Trump account, and he said the name without apology, the way he said most things. His critics would seize on the branding immediately, and he knew they would, and he had decided before the announcement that their objections would prove his point for him. If a program carried his name and delivered money to every American child, regardless of background, regardless of zip code, regardless of the circumstances into which they had been born, then the name on the account was not a vanity. It was a guarantee. It meant something about what the program would do, and who it would reach, and how seriously the administration had staked its reputation on making it work. The rollout was staged. First came the executive framework, signed in a ceremony that drew cameras and invited guests, and the particular kind of quiet attention that attends moments that feel, even to skeptics, like they might be real. Trump stood at the podium with the ease of a man who had been in front of cameras longer than most politicians had been in public life. And he spoke not in the cadences of policy explanation, but in the rhythms of address, "This is for your children," he said. "This is something no one can take from them." The private fundraising component was announced in the same week. A foundation structure was established to accept donations from corporations, philanthropists, and private individuals, with the understanding that contributions would be matched on a tiered basis by federal appropriation and distributed across the account pool. The model was unusual, a hybrid of public entitlement and private philanthropy that did not fit cleanly into either the vocabulary of the welfare state or the vocabulary of market conservatism. That was intentional. Trump had always been most comfortable in the territory between established categories, where the usual rules about what was possible tended to be weakest. Among economists, the debate ignited quickly. Supporters pointed to evidence from smaller-scale children's savings programs in several states, where even modest seed accounts had produced measurable changes in educational expectation and financial behavior by the time the children reached adolescence. The accounts functioned not just as capital, but as signal. A child who knew that money existed in their name, earmarked for their future, began to think differently about what that future contained. Opponents raised questions about fiscal scale and the mechanics of administration, about whether the private fundraising would materialize in sufficient volume to sustain the program's ambition beyond the political attention of the moment. Trump was aware of both arguments. He had read summaries prepared by his economic team and had asked pointed questions during briefings, the kind that revealed he was listening more carefully than his public persona sometimes suggested. What he returned to, again and again, was the image of the account itself, the physical or digital fact of a number in a ledger with a child's name attached to it. That image, he believed, was worth arguing for. It was the kind of concrete thing that outlasted the abstractions people used to argue against it. The announcement drew responses from across the political landscape that sorted themselves almost immediately along predictable lines, and then broke from those lines in ways that surprised the commentators who had predicted the responses. Several progressive voices acknowledged cautiously that the underlying structure shared DNA with proposals their own side had long advocated. Several fiscal conservatives expressed genuine enthusiasm for the private fundraising component as a model for hybrid governance. The criticism that lingered was not about the concept, but about the execution, about whether the funding would hold, whether the administration would stay focused on implementation through the inevitable complications of a second term, whether the name on the account was a promise or a performance. Trump did not spend much time with those questions in public. He had made his calculation about the program the way he made most consequential calculations, not by resolving every uncertainty but by deciding that the thing was worth doing, that the uncertainty was the price of ambition, and that the moment to move was now rather than after the doubts had been addressed. In the Rose Garden, after the signing, he had paused at the edge of the ceremony and looked out at the gathered crowd, staff, donors, invited families with young children, and said something that was not on the prepared remarks but that the pool reporters captured. Every one of those kids now has something. That's the point. That's the whole point. He walked back inside before the cameras could catch his expression, settling into something quieter than the performance required. Chapter 94. Fiscal Stalemate. The clocks on the eastern seaboard had barely swept past midnight into October when the lights in the federal buildings along the National Mall ceased to matter. Not in any ceremonial sense. Not with flags lowered or speeches delivered. The government of the United States simply stopped, the way a machine stops when someone removes the fuel, quietly and then all at once. In the residence at the White House, Donald Trump had gone to bed knowing it was coming. He had, in fact, been watching it approach for weeks the way a man watches weather gather on the horizon, calculating not whether the storm will arrive, but how useful it might prove. The autumn of 2025 had arrived in Washington the way it often does, brilliant, deceptive, the trees along Pennsylvania Avenue erupting in color while the city beneath them shook with a low, continuous dread. Funding under the FY 2025 measures had expired on September 30th, and Congress had failed to agree on either full-year appropriations or a short-term continuing resolution. The numbers told a stark institutional story. Republicans controlled the House. Republicans controlled the Senate. And yet the Senate's 60-vote threshold for passage made Democratic cooperation not a courtesy but a mathematical necessity, a dependency the White House had chosen not to acknowledge and the opposition had chosen to weaponize. Pillsbury Winthrop Shaw Pittman. From October 1st to November 12, 2025, the federal government of the United States was shut down as Congress failed to pass appropriations legislation for the fiscal year 2026. 43 days. The longest in history. At least 670,000 federal employees were furloughed, while roughly 730,000 continued to work without pay. The numbers were staggering in their abstraction, the way casualty figures become abstract when they grow too large. But the individual weight of those numbers was anything but. Across the country, families in Northern Virginia and suburban Maryland, in Kansas City and San Diego and the sprawling reaches of Alaska, began drafting budgets on kitchen tables. How many weeks could they survive without a paycheck? How long before the mortgage became a negotiation? Wikipedia Bipartisan Policy Center. The political pressures of this moment were unlike anything Trump's second term had yet produced, and they were unlike anything even his restless appetite for conflict had fully anticipated. Negotiations stalled over spending levels, the extension of Affordable Care Act premium tax credits, and the scope of executive authority to manage or withhold previously approved funds. The healthcare subsidies question was, in one sense, a technical dispute about tax policy. In another sense, it was a proxy war, Democrats forcing a public confrontation over the administration's willingness to let coverage for millions of Americans lapse, while Republicans accused them of holding the entire federal apparatus hostage to a single policy demand. Neither characterization was wholly false. Neither was wholly honest. Pillsbury Winthrop Shaw Pittman. What the shutdown exposed, more nakedly than either party wished to admit, was a structural fracture within the Republican coalition itself. House Republicans on the Appropriations Committee had been at odds with the Trump administration, and some conservatives over how to avert the shutdown, with frustration mounting over the absence of a top-line budget number from the House, Senate, and White House as appropriators continued their work. The friction was not merely procedural. It was philosophical. Some Republicans believed governing meant passing budgets. The White House had come to believe that a shutdown might accomplish things a budget never could. Fox News. That belief had an architect, and his name was Russell Vought. In 2023, Vought had spoken at an event hosted by his own conservative think tank, the Center for Renewing America, where he described his vision to restructure the federal government by freezing programs, dismantling agencies, and firing workers. "We want the bureaucrats to be traumatically affected," he had said. "When they wake up in the morning, we want them to not want to go to work because they are increasingly viewed as the villains. We want to put them in trauma." Trump had heard those words and done something instinctive. He had rewarded the man who said them with the most powerful budget office in the federal government. He referred to Vought approvingly as the Grim Reaper. WBUR News. When the shutdown began on October 1st, Trump and Vought moved to fire thousands of federal employees and signaled they might withhold back pay for furloughed workers, actions that critics argued would violate the Government Employee Fair Treatment Act that Trump himself had signed into law in 2019. The legal contradictions were, to Trump, beside the point. He had always understood the law less as a boundary than as a terrain, something to be navigated, contested, appealed, relitigated. Whether any particular action was permissible was a question for courts, and courts took time. House Budget Committee Democrats. On October 10th, as the shutdown entered its second week, more than 4,000 federal employees received layoff notices. Russell Vought announced the development with a single line posted to the social media platform X. The RIFs have begun. 3 words. No elaboration. No apology. It was a statement calibrated not for the employees who received those notices, but for the audience that had elected Donald Trump precisely because they believed the federal workforce was too large, too entrenched, too protective of its own prerogatives. To that audience, Vought's message landed like a trumpet note. Washington Times. Senator Susan Collins, a Maine Republican, said she strongly opposed the decision to lay off federal workers. She was not alone among Republicans in her discomfort, though she was among the most willing to say so publicly. The more telling silence came from the members who privately shared her concerns, but calculated that opposing the White House on this particular battlefield carried costs they were unwilling to pay. Loyalty in the Trump era had always operated less like a virtue and more like a currency, and the exchange rate was merciless. Washington Times. Trump watched all of it. The protests outside agency buildings, the legal filings in federal court, the hand-wringing from Collins and a handful of Senate moderates, with the detachment of a man reading reviews for a film he has already decided is a success. He had been in this position before, operationally, if not constitutionally. The 2018-2019 shutdown over border wall funding had lasted 35 days and ended in what his critics characterized as capitulation. He had not forgotten that. He had filed it under a different category entirely, a negotiation that continued. This time, the calculus was different. This time, the shutdown was not simply about what he wanted from Congress. It was about what he wanted to do to the government itself. The distinction mattered enormously. A shutdown pursued as leverage eventually reaches its natural terminus, the point at which the political cost of continuation exceeds the value of the demand being pressed. But a shutdown pursued as restructuring has no such natural limit. The pain it inflicts is the point. The disruption is the policy. On November 12th, Congress passed a funding measure and the shutdown ended. The legislation included a provision to undo any reductions in force issued during the shutdown's 43 days. The reversal was a legislative rebuke, however procedural its form. The furloughed workers would be made whole, at least on paper. The federal agencies would reopen their doors. The crisis would be declared, in the language of official Washington, resolved. Brookings. But resolution is rarely the same as conclusion. Because Congress failed to pass 6 remaining spending bills, covering the Departments of Defense, Labor, Homeland Security, State, Transportation, Treasury, and Housing and Urban Development, before they expired on January 30, 2026, a brief second shutdown ensued. On February 3, Congress funded all of the affected agencies except Homeland Security for the full fiscal year. The exception was not incidental. Homeland Security, the sprawling department that housed Immigration and Customs Enforcement, the Border Patrol, and the mechanisms of Trump's defining domestic priority, remained in a state of suspended animation, funded piecemeal, its operational posture shaped as much by White House preference as by congressional mandate. Brookings. The 43-day shutdown had accomplished one thing its architects had quietly intended, and its critics had underestimated. It had moved the frame. What had once seemed like a crisis, the government of the world's largest economy grinding to a halt, nearly 1 million federal workers missing paychecks, essential services suspended, had been normalized into a negotiating tactic, a seasonal feature of American governance rather than a failure of it. The country had not collapsed. The markets had wobbled but recovered. The newspapers had filled and then emptied. And somewhere, in the deliberate patience of all that endurance, a lesson had been encoded. The disruption of government could be survived, and more than survived, it could be exploited. What no one in the West Wing had yet fully reckoned with was that the federal workers, who had endured 43 days of uncertainty, whose layoff notices had been reversed by legislative act rather than administrative mercy, had not forgotten who had sent them, and that the quiet reorganization of their loyalties, their unions, their political energies, would surface at a moment not yet visible on any calendar that mattered. Chapter 95. The Architecture of Loyalty. The memo arrived at the Office of Personnel Management on a Tuesday morning in the early months of 2025, and it was not, by Washington standards, a document of particular visual drama. No executive seal embossed in gold. No sweeping presidential rhetoric. It was, in form, the kind of bureaucratic instrument that career officials in the federal government had spent decades learning to navigate around, dense with regulatory citations, cross-hatched with legal qualifications, the language of policy rather than power. But the woman who set it on her desk and read it twice in the pale fluorescent light of her office on Massachusetts Avenue understood immediately what she was holding. This was not a memo. This was a map of a new country. The final rules governing schedule policy career, the regulatory architecture that would convert tens of thousands of federal career positions into at-will employment, had cleared their last internal hurdle. The civil service, as Americans had known it, since the Pendleton Act of 1883, was about to be fundamentally remade. And the man who had ordered it done was not in the room. He was never in the room for these moments. That was, in itself, the point. Donald Trump had learned something in the years between his first presidency and his return to the Oval Office that neither his admirers nor his critics had fully credited him with learning: the lesson of the machinery. His first term had been defined in part by the gap between his intentions and his instruments. He had wanted loyalty and received a government full of people who believed their constitutional obligations superseded his wishes. He had appointed men and women who went on to testify against him, contradict him, and in his estimation, betray him at every turn. James Mattis, Rex Tillerson, John Kelly. The list in Trump's private accounting was long and unforgiving. He had spent the years since turning that list into a curriculum. By the time he returned to power, in January 2025, the philosophical infrastructure of what would come to be called Schedule F, reborn in 2025 under the new designation Schedule Policy Career, had been constructed not in haste but in deliberate, patient architectural detail. The Heritage Foundation's Project 2025, whatever Trump's public disavowals of it during the campaign, had provided the blueprint. Loyalists had been pre-vetted, pre-slotted, pre-positioned. The government Trump was inheriting would not be the government that had frustrated him the first time. That government had to be rebuilt from its foundations, and the foundations, it turned out, were the people. The political atmosphere of early 2025 was thick with a particular kind of electricity, the voltage of a coalition that believed, with complete conviction, that the democratic process had finally delivered what the democratic process was supposed to deliver, and that the delivery was now subject to interference from an entrenched class of unelected administrators who served not the people, but themselves. This was not merely a talking point, constructed for consumption by cable news audiences. It was a genuine and deeply held conviction among the architects of the second Trump administration, and it extended from the ideological theorists in the think tanks to the young political appointees now flooding into federal agencies with lists of names and mandates that left little room for ambiguity. Russ Vought returned to the Office of Management and Budget with the specific intention of executing what he had described in writing as a complete dismantling of the administrative state's autonomy, was perhaps the clearest embodiment of this conviction. Where Trump operated through instinct, through the reading of rooms and the sensing of advantage, Vought operated through doctrine. He had studied the legal architecture of the civil service with the forensic patience of a litigator preparing a decades-long case. And what he had concluded was that the Pendleton Act's promise of merit-based, politically insulated federal employment had curdled into something else entirely: a permanent class of government employees whose insulation from political accountability had become, in his view, a form of unelected power. The question was not whether to challenge that power. The question was how thoroughly. The schedule policy, career rules that OPM finalized in the opening months of the second Trump administration, addressed that question with a precision that stunned even experienced observers of federal employment law. Under the new framework, federal employees in positions that touched on policy, a category that could, depending on interpretation, encompass enormous swaths of the civil service, could be reclassified into a new employment category that stripped them of the procedural protections that had historically made it nearly impossible to remove them without documented cause and extensive review. They would serve, in the new language of the rules, at the pleasure of the administration. They would be, in the old language of human understanding, fireable. The practical implications radiated outward from that simple fact in waves. An environmental scientist at the EPA, who produced findings inconvenient to the administration's energy agenda, could be removed not because the science was disputed — the rules did not require that it be — but because the position had been reclassified as policy adjacent, and the employee's continued presence was deemed inconsistent with the president's agenda. An economist at the Treasury, whose models challenged the administration's tariff projections, could be shown the door with procedural dispatch that would have been unimaginable a year earlier. A Foreign Service officer, whose cables expressed skepticism about a presidential diplomatic initiative, could be reclassified and removed before the cable had been filed in any official archive. Trump, in his public characterizations of the policy, employed the vocabulary he had always favored: common sense, efficiency, accountability, waste. The government was full of deep state operatives. They had undermined him before. They would not be permitted to undermine him again. The framing was, like most of his most effective rhetoric, both genuinely felt and strategically deployed, a compound of authentic grievance and calculated mobilization that his critics consistently underestimated by dismissing it as purely cynical performance. But in private, the conversations around the schedule policy, career rules, engaged a different register. The people closest to the implementation, the deputy directors, the policy council, the career to political transition managers, understood that what they were constructing was not merely a personnel management reform. They were altering the relationship between the executive branch and the professional class that had administered it for generations. And that alteration, once made, would not be simple to reverse. The reclassification of a position was an administrative action. The cultural transformation of an institution, the replacement of a workforce that understood itself as professionally independent with one that understood itself as politically accountable, was something that outlasted any individual personnel decision. It was in a meeting with OPM officials in late winter of 2025 that Trump offered what people in the room would later describe, in separate conversations that yielded strikingly similar accounts, as his clearest statement of purpose. He had been presented with the final timeline for the rollout of the rules, the phase-in schedule, the agency-by-agency sequencing, the legal defense strategy for the inevitable court challenges. He had listened, which was not always his habit in such meetings, and then he had leaned forward and said something that those present would spend years parsing for its full implications. He said, "I want people who want to be there. If they don't want to be there, they should leave. And if they stay and don't do what they're supposed to do, I want them gone." That's not complicated. That's how every business in the world works. The only place it doesn't work that way is the government. We're going to fix that. The room had absorbed this. The lawyers in it knew that the statement, while legally imprecise, was operationally exact. The rules being finalized were, at their core, a mechanism for making that statement into enforceable reality. The figure who shaped the implementation more than any other, outside the White House itself, was Charles Ezell, who had been installed at OPM with the specific mandate to execute the schedule policy, career transformation, without the equivocation that had, in the administration's view, diluted similar efforts during the first term. Ezell was not a figure of particular public visibility, which was part of his utility. He was methodical, loyal in the way that the second Trump administration had learned to value loyalty, not as personal affection, which could curdle, but as ideological alignment, which did not require tending. He believed what he was doing was correct, and that belief made him a more effective instrument than someone who merely followed orders. The relationship between Trump and the officials executing his personnel revolution was itself illustrative of the larger dynamic the second term was constructing. Trump did not manage the policy details of schedule policy, career. He did not sit with the regulatory text. He set the direction with a clarity that brooked no misunderstanding. He wanted a government that worked for him, that meant what he thought it should mean, that was populated by people who saw the world the way he saw it. And then he delegated the architecture to people who shared that clarity and possessed the technical capability to build toward it. The president, who had been accused, throughout his first term, of being unable to construct lasting institutional change, had learned, between his terms, that lasting institutional change was a project for people with patience, and that his role was not to possess that patience himself, but to provide the mandate that made it possible for patient people to work. The unions representing federal employees, particularly the American Federation of Government Employees, which had fought the Schedule F rules during Trump's first term with the expectation that their legal challenges would succeed, found themselves facing a second iteration of the policy that had been legally stress-tested specifically against the vulnerabilities the courts had identified the first time. The administration's lawyers had spent the intervening years studying the injunctions and appeals that had paused the original implementation, and the new rules had been drafted with those judicial roadblocks specifically in mind. The litigation began, as everyone had expected it to begin, within days of the final rules publication in the Federal Register. But the pace of the courts and the pace of the implementation were not synchronized, and the administration moved. Between the legal challenges, between the congressional statements of concern, between the op-eds and the congressional testimony, and the academic papers on the constitutional implications of what was being done, the reclassifications proceeded. Quietly, in the aggregate, one position at a time, then batches, then, as the administrative machinery found its rhythm, at a pace that began to transform the composition of certain agencies in ways that would take years to fully map. The resistance was real but diffuse. Federal employees who objected could comply and remain, raising their concerns through whatever official channels remained open to them, channels that were simultaneously being reshaped by the same administrative transformation they might have wished to use. They could resign, which many did, particularly among the senior career officials who had spent decades building expertise in domains that the administration's political appointees were now taking over. Or they could stay and watch, calculating that political administrations passed and institutional knowledge endured, a calculation that had served the civil service through many political seasons, but that the architects of this moment had specifically designed to make less reliable. What Trump was constructing, through the patient machinery of OPM and the regulatory process, was a government in which the word career meant something different than it had meant before. A government in which the protection of the career civil servant was conditional on their alignment with presidential policy, in which the independence of the expert was reframed as the resistance of the unaccountable, in which the machinery of the administrative state ran not on its own professional logic but on the direction, provided by the man in the Oval Office, who had spent the years of his exile understanding, with a clarity he had lacked before, exactly how that machinery worked and exactly how to make it his own. The rules were finalized. The rollout had begun. And somewhere, in the federal building directories of Washington, in the offices of agencies whose missions had been built over generations by professionals who believed in the idea of a government that served the public rather than the president, a new kind of calculus was being made by people who understood that the ground had shifted beneath them in ways they could not yet fully see, and that the man who had shifted it was only beginning. Chapter 96. Strait of Hormuz Crisis. The tanker appeared on the Situation Room screens at 4:47 in the morning, listing badly in the gray-green thermal imaging, its hull ribboned with smoke. Somewhere in the darkness above the Persian Gulf, a drone had found its mark. The vessel, a Panamanian-flagged crude carrier, contracted through a South Korean energy firm, had been struck 22 nautical miles off the Iranian coast, close enough to the Strait of Hormuz that the choke point itself seemed to shudder. Trump was told within minutes. He had not been asleep. Those who worked the overnight shifts in those months would later describe a president who seemed to inhabit the small hours with a particular restlessness, as though the machinery of his mind refused the luxury of quiet. By the time he reached the Situation Room in the early morning of that spring day in 2026, aides recall that he was not disheveled or drowsy. He was, as one senior NSC official put it, already at full temperature. He looked at the smoking tanker on the screen, said nothing for a moment, and then turned to his military advisors and asked a question that would define the next 72 hours. How many of these do they think they can sink before we respond? The question was not rhetorical. It was, in its blunt precision, exactly the kind of thing that made Trump both maddening and clarifying to work for. He was not asking for an intelligence assessment. He was establishing a threshold, and doing so out loud, in front of the room, before any of the careful men in suits could frame it diplomatically. It was a habit that went back decades, to the conference rooms of the Trump Organization, to the casino floors of Atlantic City, to the gilded negotiating suites where he had made and unmade deals with equal velocity. He had always believed that power was expressed not through procedure, but through the willingness to name the thing everyone else was circling. The world into which this crisis arrived had been under extraordinary strain since the preceding autumn, when the Trump administration's escalating campaign against Iranian nuclear infrastructure had crossed from covert pressure into something considerably more visible. The full arc of that campaign, the combination of cyber attacks, targeted strikes on logistics networks, and the quiet authorization of Israeli operations deep inside Iranian territory, had unfolded over months with the incremental logic of a slow-building fire. By early 2026, what had begun as a surgical effort to degrade Tehran's enrichment capacity had evolved into something the administration's critics were calling, with growing alarm, a rolling military campaign. The White House preferred the term sustained deterrence operations, a phrase that appeared in press briefings with the regularity of a liturgical response and conveyed approximately as much heat. The oil markets had been registering their own verdict long before the tanker attack. Brent crude had climbed steadily through the winter months, breaching $90 a barrel by February, and the futures markets were pricing in a kind of anxiety that no official reassurance could fully suppress. The Strait of Hormuz carries roughly a fifth of the world's traded oil, through a passage barely 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. It is, in the language of geopolitics, a choke point, a word that contains within it its own warning. When Tehran began what it called defensive naval exercises in the waters adjacent to the strait in late March, the price of crude moved before any military analyst could type a sentence about it. The markets, as they often do, understood the geometry of catastrophe before the governments did. But the strike on the tanker was different. It was not an exercise. It was not a warning, communicated through diplomatic back channels or through the elaborate semaphore of state media. It was a burning ship with 17 sailors aboard, a distress signal going out into the early morning dark, and a price ticker in London and New York beginning to move in a direction that sent finance ministers reaching for telephones. Within hours of the strike, crude had surged $11 a barrel. The Kuwaiti and Saudi markets opened and immediately registered the tremor. In Washington, the Treasury Department convened an emergency session that the public would not learn about until a congressional report surfaced 3 months later. The domestic political implications were immediate and acute. Gasoline prices in the United States, which had already been a source of persistent frustration for an administration that had staked considerable credibility on energy abundance, threatened to spike in the weeks before a midterm election season that was already testing the limits of Republican cohesion. It was here that the core conflict of those days revealed itself in its fullest complexity. Trump faced not a single adversary, but a tripartite pressure that bore down on him from 3 directions simultaneously. From Tehran, there was the calculated provocation. Iranian military commanders and the Revolutionary Guard understood perfectly well the domestic political vulnerabilities of a president whose approval on economic management had been eroding, and the tanker strike was as much a political weapon as a military one. From within his own government, there was the institutional pressure of generals and intelligence chiefs who counseled restraint and drew up options that ranged from the surgical to the catastrophic, each carrying its own cascade of consequences. And from the Republican coalition itself, from the energy producers in Texas and the Dakotas who were watching the global supply disruption with a mixture of alarm and private opportunism, from the congressional leadership who needed clarity before they went home to their districts, there was the pressure of expectation. They had elected a man who had promised to project strength. Now the market was on fire, and the strait was contested, and the question was what strength actually looked like when the cost of it showed up at the gas pump. Trump's response, when it came, was characteristically oblique in its public expression, and considerably more direct in its operational reality. The tweet he had returned to posting on X with the relish of a man reunited with a favorite instrument came at 7:14 a.m. and read in its entirety, "Iran made a very big mistake. They know what comes next. God bless our sailors." The sentence structure was typical, a statement of fact, an assertion of hidden knowledge, a benediction. Analysts parsed it through the morning. Military correspondents noted the deliberate vagueness of what comes next, and the markets, which had briefly stabilized on rumors of a diplomatic channel opening, lurched again. Within the government, the picture was considerably sharper. The orders that went through the chain of command in the hours following the strike authorized a set of responses that were described in classified briefings as proportional but demonstrative, a formulation that the military brass understood to mean swift, visible, and calibrated to communicate that the rules of the previous period had changed. The revealing action, the one that would later serve as the hinge point for historians and adversaries alike in understanding Trump's decision-making during those weeks, came not in the form of a missile strike or a naval maneuver but in a phone call. On the morning after the tanker attack, Trump placed a direct call to Mohammed bin Salman, the Saudi crown prince, that lasted, according to aides who were briefed on it afterward, just under 40 minutes. What was said in full remains classified. What emerged from it, however, was a coordinated message delivered through Saudi diplomatic channels to Iranian interlocutors in Baghdad. The United States would not absorb another strike on commercial shipping, and the response to any further incident would not be limited to the theater in which the provocation occurred. It was the old Trump logic, the logic of Mar-a-Lago and the boardroom and the decades of high-stakes negotiation, applied to the architecture of a potential regional war. He had not picked up the phone to consult. He had picked it up to act, to insert himself directly into the circuitry of Middle Eastern power, without the mediation of the State Department apparatus or the interagency process that his advisers perpetually urged upon him. It was, depending on one's vantage point, either the decisive move of a man who understood leverage or the reckless improvisation of one who trusted his instincts over the accumulated institutional wisdom of the foreign policy establishment. Perhaps, as with so many of his more consequential choices, it was inseparable from both. The figure who moved most visibly through this crisis at Trump's side was not a general or a diplomat, but Marco Rubio, who had by this point completed one of the more remarkable political rehabilitations in modern American history, having traveled from Little Marco to Secretary of State with the particular adaptability of a man who had concluded that survival required proximity to power rather than opposition to it. Rubio and Trump had developed, over the preceding year, something that resembled a working partnership, not the warmth of genuine friendship which Trump reserved for those who had never seriously challenged him, but the functional trust of men who understood each other's incentives clearly. In the days of the Hormuz crisis, Rubio was the administration's public face, appearing before cameras with a measured gravity that provided cover for the more aggressive posture being established behind closed doors. He spoke of red lines and consequences with a precision that satisfied the foreign policy press, while committing the administration to nothing it had not already decided. Trump, for his part, was watching. He had long believed that loyalty was a renewable resource only when regularly tested, and the crisis was, among its other qualities, a test. Rubio did not flinch, did not freelance, did not offer qualifications that deviated from the message. The relationship, which had always carried the faint undertone of provisional trust, solidified in those days into something sturdier, a partnership calibrated to a world that seemed to be accelerating toward confrontations that neither man could fully predict. The energy markets, meanwhile, were conducting their own reckoning. The spike in crude prices sent secondary tremors through the American economy with the reliable cruelty of a transmission mechanism that cares nothing for political timing. Jet fuel costs rose. Trucking costs rose. The price of diesel, which moves food and goods across the American interior, climbed to levels that prompted howls from agricultural states that had delivered Trump his margins in multiple cycles. The administration responded with a combination of strategic petroleum reserve releases, emergency coordination with Gulf state producers, and a messaging campaign that attempted to frame the price increases as the short-term cost of long-term security, a formulation that played reasonably well in editorial rooms and catastrophically in diner conversations in the swing suburbs of Pennsylvania and Michigan. The midterms were 8 months away. 8 months, in the arithmetic of American politics, is at once an eternity and an instant. What the crisis revealed, beyond its immediate tactical dimensions, was the degree to which the second Trump administration had committed itself to a posture toward Iran from which retreat was structurally difficult. The escalating campaign of the preceding months had created facts on the ground and facts in the water that constrained the options available. Each step had generated a counter-step, and the accumulation of those exchanges had produced a situation that was neither war nor peace, but something in between, a permanent, managed confrontation in one of the world's most consequential shipping lanes, with the price of oil serving as a kind of continuous referendum on how well the management was going. Trump had always thrived in environments of controlled chaos, in the space between resolution and collapse where a certain kind of dealmaker finds his leverage. The question that the Hormuz crisis pressed with mounting insistence, and that his advisers discussed in the careful language of people who knew they were being listened to, was whether the chaos in the strait could in fact be controlled, or whether the next burning tanker would be the one that tipped the balance into something none of them had fully wargamed. The sailors on the struck vessel were evacuated by Allied naval assets within hours. All 17 survived. The ship itself was a total loss, its hull settling slowly into the shallow waters at the edge of the Persian Gulf, a column of dark smoke visible on satellite imagery for 3 days. Trump mentioned the sailors twice more in public, once at a rally in Ohio where the crowd responded with the reflexive patriotism that he had always understood how to summon, and once in a brief exchange with reporters on the South Lawn where he said with a finality that closed the subject, "They're fine. We took care of it." In the ledger of the moment, that was true. The sailors were fine. The ship was gone. The oil was still moving through the strait, if less freely than before, and the price at the pump was climbing toward levels that no amount of rally energy could fully obscure from the people paying it. Somewhere, in a Tehran ministry, a damage assessment was being written. It would take months to surface in the intelligence reporting that reached the Situation Room, and by the time it did, the calculation it contained, about how far the Americans could be pushed before they crossed a threshold they could not walk back from, would already have begun to shape decisions that nobody in Washington had yet imagined needing to make. Chapter 97. Mass Deportations. The footage was 43 seconds long. A gray Honda Pilot sat motionless on Portland Avenue in South Minneapolis, its engine idling in the January cold. Federal agents in tactical gear moved toward it from 2 directions simultaneously. A gloved hand reached for the door handle. Then the car inched forward, slowly, ambiguously, in the manner of a person startled or confused, and the gunshots came in rapid succession, 3 of them punching through steel and glass. The car lurched, ran, and crashed into a parked vehicle 100 yards down the street. When bystanders rushed forward, they found Renee Nicole Good, 37 years old, a mother and American citizen, bleeding out on the seat. Across town, Minneapolis Police Chief Brian O'Hara heard the call come over the scanner and drove to Portland Avenue. What he found, a crumpled Honda, hundreds of federal agents materializing from what seemed like every side street, a crowd already gathering at the edge of yellow tape, looked to him less like an immigration enforcement action and more like the opening scene of something he could not yet name. Hennepin County Attorney Mary Moriarty, watching the bystander video on her phone in the middle of an unrelated meeting, said nothing for a moment. Then she looked up at the faces around the conference table. "We're going to have to end this meeting." That evening, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz reached Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem by phone. He told her what he believed, that something had gone gravely wrong, that a citizen was dead, that the city was about to come apart. Noem, by Walz's account, dismissed his concerns without pause and announced that Renee Good had committed an act of domestic terrorism. "I said, I hope you can sleep well tonight, Kristi," Walz would later recall. The line went dead. The killing of Renee Good, on January 7, 2026, was, in the most literal sense, the consequence of a machine that Donald Trump had spent the better part of a decade assembling, and the better part of his second term running at full throttle. Operation Metro Surge had been launched by the Department of Homeland Security in December 2025, deploying thousands of federal agents to the Minneapolis-St. Paul area in what officials described as the largest immigration operation in American history. It was the apotheosis of a philosophy that Trump had articulated to rally crowds since 2015, that the nation was being invaded, that the invasion demanded a military-scale response, and that the men and women willing to prosecute that response deserved his full and unconditional loyalty. What the operation produced, in the first weeks of the new year, was a city that looked and felt like a country at war with itself. Encyclopedia Britannica. The operation deployed more than 3,000 ICE and CBP officers in the Twin Cities and throughout Minnesota, heavily targeting Somali and Southeast Asian refugee communities. Enforcement was characterized by arrest tactics that critics called brutal, and the community response was overwhelming. Schools were forced to go into lockdown. Business owners closed their doors. Customer-facing businesses in Minneapolis reported revenue decreases of 50 to 80% as the community stayed home, too frightened to go out. The city that Carl Sandburg might have called the Minneapolis of the North, immigrant-built, working-class, stubbornly civic, had become something else, a laboratory. ILRC City of Minneapolis. The political architecture that made this possible had been constructed with characteristic Trumpian audacity. The GOP's signature One Big Beautiful Bill Act, passed solely by Republicans through the reconciliation process, had given Homeland Security more than $170 billion in funding to conduct immigration enforcement through 2029, more than double DHS's annual discretionary budget. Of that total, ICE received nearly $75 billion, including $30 billion for enforcement and removal operations. This was not an improvised campaign. It was a siege funded in perpetuity, insulated from the ordinary congressional levers that democracies use to moderate executive power. Tom Homan, the former acting ICE director whom Trump had designated border czar, had sketched the ambition plainly during the transition. He wanted 100,000 detention beds. He wanted ICE offices across the country, out on the streets on day one. He had said so on television without apology, without euphemism, with the flat certainty of a man who believed the country had given him a mandate and intended to honor it. AOL. Since taking office on January 20, 2025, the administration had pursued an unprecedented mass deportation agenda, adopting tactics that were widely described as legally questionable, expanding expedited removal, sending people from the United States to offshore detention facilities at Guantanamo, terminating protected legal statuses, and forcibly transferring individuals to countries of which they were not citizens. By April 2026, ICE Flight Monitor tracked 245 removal flights in a single month, a record since independent flight tracking began in 2020, representing a 94% increase in flights compared to April 2025. The machinery of removal had been not merely restarted, but fundamentally rebuilt and supercharged. Human rights first, human rights first. The core conflict of this chapter in Trump's presidency was not at its root logistical. It was political, and it arrived in the form of a paradox that no amount of executive bravado could dissolve. The man who had staked his political identity on the promise of deportation, who had used the phrase mass deportation as a kind of liturgical incantation at thousands of rallies, now found himself politically endangered by the execution of that very promise. An NBC News poll, released in early 2026, found that while 53% of voters approved of Trump's handling of border security, 54% disapproved of his handling of immigration specifically, amid the pushback generated by the deaths of Renee Good and Alex Preddy in Minnesota. A Gallup survey found Americans disapproving of Trump's handling of immigration by a margin of 62 to 35%, with nearly 7 in 10 independents registering disapproval, his worst numbers on the issue yet, and part of a clearly downward trend. NBC News Yahoo. The revealing action, the one that opens the keyhole widest onto Trump's character in this moment, was not a speech or an executive order. It was a private admission, delivered in conversation with his wife and his closest advisors, that the words he had bellowed into microphones for a decade had become, in their operational reality, a liability. In conversations with top advisors and with Melania, Trump had become convinced that some of his administration's deportation policies had gone too far, and that voters did not like the term mass deportation. He directed his team to pivot their focus toward arresting criminal bad guys, rather than causing visible chaos in American cities. The First Lady, characteristically quiet in public and characteristically direct in private, was among those who helped make the case. Hardline targets, such as the 1 million deportations goal set in 2025 by advisor Stephen Miller, had not been met. The gap between the promise and the performance was becoming visible, and visibility was the one thing Trump could never tolerate. Almex. The key figure in navigating this retreat, or, as the White House preferred, this reset, was Susie Wiles, the chief of staff who had run Trump's 2024 campaign with the cold organizational precision of a field general, and now found herself managing the political fallout of a policy that had escaped its own designers. Wiles believed the president's immigration team had taken one of his marquee issues and turned it into a challenging one ahead of the midterms. The shift was spearheaded by Homan, who had taken over ICE operations in Minneapolis and who preferred a focus on bread-and-butter arrests of criminals, particularly those who could be handed over by local jails. Wiles, who had recently disclosed a cancer diagnosis even as she continued working, was said to have told associates, with the clipped directness that characterized everything she did, that she couldn't understand how the administration had made the mistake of deporting two mothers who had voluntarily appeared at routine immigration check-ins. "I can't understand how you make that mistake, but somebody did," she reportedly said. It was, in miniature, the entire dilemma, a presidency that had built a demolition machine and was only now reckoning with the question of what exactly it was demolishing. Substachial. Meanwhile, Congress had handed Trump's opponents an unexpected tool. DHS entered a partial shutdown on February 13, 2026, after Republicans and Democrats failed to reach a deal on immigration enforcement reforms. Democrats had refused to vote for a fiscal 2026 DHS funding bill without reforms to ICE and CBP, demanding, among other things, that officers stop masking their identities in public, stop making arrests in sensitive locations like schools, and end the practice of entering homes without judicial warrants. But ICE, whose workers were considered essential and stayed on the job during a shutdown, was not hurting for money. It had the reconciliation billions, and it had the will. DHS vowed that deportation operations would continue, and Acting Assistant Secretary Lauren Biss told reporters that ICE will continue arresting public safety threats from our communities and will not allow the Democrats to slow us down. The shutdown was real. The deportations continued regardless. The machinery, once built, did not require the ordinary democratic rituals of appropriation to keep running. AOL+2. What had been achieved was not, in the narrow operational sense, a failure. Nearly 3 million people had left the United States by January 20, 2026, approximately 2.2 million self-repatriations, and more than 675,000 formal removals. And the country experienced net negative migration in 2025 for the first time in more than 50 years. By the measures Trump had always insisted mattered, the numbers were staggering. He had done what he said he would do. American thinker. But the argument that numbers were all that mattered had collided, on a gray January morning on Portland Avenue, with the face of Renee Good. 37 seconds of bystander video. 3 gunshots. A dead American citizen. In conversations among top advisors, the White House had grown convinced that some of its deportation policies had gone too far, and that voters did not like the term mass deportation. The machine was being asked to slow down, to become quieter, to do the same work in a lower register. What no one inside the West Wing had yet fully reckoned with was whether an apparatus built for maximum velocity could be reliably calibrated to something more moderate, and whether the men who had been licensed to use it in cities across the country had understood from the beginning that the license had any limits at all. Voila. Stephen Miller, who had designed the theoretical architecture of all of this with the methodical zeal of an ideologue who had waited his entire adult life for the opportunity, was watching from his office. He said nothing publicly. He was patient. He had always been patient. And the policies he had embedded in statute, in appropriations, in the very institutional DNA of the agencies now deployed across the country, had a longevity that no press conference and no political recalibration could easily undo, a fact that would become undeniable as the midterm elections drew closer and the quiet operations continued, flight by chartered flight, in the dark hours before dawn. Chapter 98. May 2026, Negotiations. The maps spread across the Resolute desk that third week of May were not the kind that hung in boardrooms or decorated the walls of statehouses. These were tactical overlays, color-coded shipping lanes, choke points, projected cargo wait times measured in the billions of dollars per day. At their center, like a thread pulled taut between two fists, lay the Strait of Hormuz, 21 miles of salt water at its narrowest, through which, in better times, roughly a fifth of the world's oil supply moved with quiet, unremarkable efficiency. It was not moving now. Roughly 240 ships sat anchored and waiting, a maritime traffic jam that had become the most visible symbol of a conflict with no clean edges and no agreed-upon name. Donald Trump, who had spent his life measuring the worth of things in square footage and cash flow, understood the calculus intuitively. Every idle tanker was a data point on an inflation chart that his political enemies were already weaponizing against him. He had wanted this to be simple. He had said from the earliest hours of the war that began on the 28th of February that it would be over quickly, days, perhaps a week. The language was familiar, almost reflexive, the same register he had used to describe trade wars, pandemic timelines, and infrastructure negotiations that somehow never arrived on schedule. What he had not fully reckoned with, or perhaps had chosen not to, was that Iran in the spring of 2026 was not a counterparty at a closing table in Midtown Manhattan. It was a wounded but calculating adversary that had discovered, to its own evident satisfaction, that the Strait of Hormuz was a lever of extraordinary force, one it could pull without firing a single missile. Since making his early assurances of swift resolution, Trump had repeatedly announced that the conflict was nearing its end, only for talks to collapse and the fragile ceasefire to fray at its seams. The world of that particular moment was already under enormous strain. The closure of the strait had set off what Gulf states described as the worst global energy crisis in decades, and higher energy prices in the United States were feeding inflation at levels not seen in years, with expectations building that the Federal Reserve might have to raise interest rates in response. The midterm elections of November 2026 were no longer a distant abstraction. They had become a barometric pressure that every Republican in a competitive district could feel in their chest. Trump understood this too. His survival instinct, always finely tuned to the proximity of political threat, had been humming for weeks. The core conflict of those May negotiations was not, at its surface, military. The shooting, such as it was, had paused. A fragile ceasefire had been in place since April 8th, punctuated by skirmishes as the United States and Iran jockeyed over the strait. The conflict was now bureaucratic, epistemic, and deeply personal in the way that only negotiations between profound mutual distrusters can become. The American position remained that Iran must commit to zero enrichment of uranium, while Tehran insisted on separating the immediate question of the strait and the ceasefire from the longer and more treacherous terrain of nuclear talks. Iran had submitted a 14-point peace proposal. Trump, without reviewing its exact wording, had said publicly he would probably reject it because, in his assessment, Tehran had not yet paid a sufficient price. This was not merely posturing. It was, in the grammar of Trump's negotiating psychology, an essential preliminary, the demonstration that he could walk away, that his appetite for a deal did not exceed his willingness to endure its absence. The revealing action came not in a summit chamber or a formal exchange of diplomatic notes, but in a late Saturday phone call in which Trump sat in the Oval Office and worked the telephone like a man dialing for votes. He called the leaders of Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Pakistan, Turkey, Egypt, Jordan, Bahrain, and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. A round of calls that was less negotiation than orchestration. Trump casting himself as the conductor of a regional coalition that would, by the sheer weight of its collective endorsement, press Tehran toward the exit he was holding open. He then posted on social media that a peace deal was largely negotiated and would be announced shortly. Iranian state media responded within hours, calling that characterization inconsistent with reality, noting that Tehran had agreed to nothing of the sort regarding control of the waterway. The gap between what Trump announced and what had actually been agreed upon was not incidental. It was structural, a feature of a man who had always believed that declaring a thing done was itself a form of doing it, that the announcement preceded and often produced the reality it described. It was Steve Witkoff who occupied the most consequential supporting role in those weeks, a figure whose prominence in Trump's diplomatic architecture continued to confound the foreign policy establishment and unsettle America's closest allies. Witkoff, a real estate developer by training, a Trump loyalist by disposition, had been handed one of the most complex diplomatic portfolios in the world, and carried it with the particular confidence of someone who had never been persuaded that expertise is a prerequisite for success. Pakistani and Qatari negotiators held talks with Iranian counterparts, staying in regular contact with Witkoff throughout, as the Americans used Islamabad as their primary interlocutor, a back-channel architecture born of necessity, given that Washington and Tehran had no formal diplomatic relations and no appetite for the optics of direct engagement. Israeli officials, meanwhile, had grown privately furious with Witkoff, believing he was pushing a deal at any cost, a charge that encapsulated the central tension in Trump's regional strategy. The president wanted his name on a historic agreement badly enough that his closest allies had begun to fear the terms he might accept to get it. There was something almost classical about the bind in which Trump found himself that May. Not Greek tragedy exactly, but Shakespearean in its irony. He had spent his first term, and the early months of his second, promising that his willingness to use force made him uniquely capable of achieving peace. The strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities the previous June, the military buildup, the ultimatums delivered via social media at odd hours, all of it had been predicated on the idea that maximum pressure, applied with sufficient theatrical conviction, would eventually crack the Iranian will. And yet here, in the spring of 2026, Iran had responded not by cracking, but by finding its own pressure point. A senior Israeli official put it with cold precision. Whatever shape the emerging agreement took, it would signal to Tehran that it possessed a weapon no less effective than a nuclear one, and that weapon was the Strait of Hormuz. Whether Trump registered the full weight of that observation, or whether it registered, and he simply declined to let it alter his course, was a question that those closest to him disagreed upon in the years that followed. Marco Rubio, attending a NATO summit in Sweden, offered the administration's careful line to reporters. There had been slight progress in the talks, he said, but he cautioned against exaggeration, adding that the fundamentals remained unchanged. Iran could never possess a nuclear weapon. It was a formulation that was simultaneously true and beside the point, like announcing that the rules of chess remained unchanged while your opponent had flipped the board. The nuclear question had been deliberately set aside by Tehran, deferred to a second phase of negotiations that may or may not materialize, and the deal that Trump was so eager to announce was, at its core, a deal about shipping lanes and frozen assets, not about the atomic architecture of the Middle East that had animated American foreign policy for a generation. By the end of that third week of May, the world was watching the strait with the focused attention that humans reserve for things that are about to break or about to hold. Within a single 24-hour window, at least 36 ships, including oil tankers, passed through with Iranian permission, a data point the White House treated as proof of progress, and that Tehran treated as a demonstration of precisely who remained in charge of the waterway. The two interpretations were not reconcilable, and somewhere in that irreconcilability lay the true shape of the agreement Trump was preparing to celebrate, a framework whose unresolved contradictions, papered over by the urgency of a ceasefire and the vanity of an announcement, were already moving like water finding its level beneath a cracked surface toward the next rupture. Chapter 99. Deregulating Capital and Science. The fluorescent lights in the Roosevelt Room hummed at a frequency that seemed, on certain mornings, to match the pitch of Washington itself, a low, institutional drone that no amount of renovation had ever quite silenced. It was in this room, sometime in the early weeks of 2025, that Donald Trump sat across from a collection of men in suits who had spent their careers studying molecules, microbes, and atmospheric data, and who now found themselves seated before a president who studied none of those things but understood with a predator's precision exactly how much their institutions could be made to bend. He did not take notes. He rarely did. He listened the way a developer listens to a contractor's objections, cataloging not the technical content but the will behind it, searching for the place where resistance would give way. The men from the Environmental Protection Agency had come with data. Trump had come with a mandate. To understand what happened next, one must understand the peculiar alchemy of the second term, the way it differed from the first not merely in degree but in kind. In 2017, Trump had arrived at the White House like a man who had purchased a hotel he had never actually stayed in, uncertain of the service entrance, suspicious of the staff, relying on instinct where he lacked blueprint. The permanent apparatus of government had absorbed him like a reef absorbs a wave, bending, allowing passage, and then reasserting its shape. He had made noise. He had issued orders. But the machinery had possessed its own centrifugal force, and much of what he attempted had been slowed, diverted, or quietly nullified by deputy secretaries and career officials who understood that time was the most effective weapon in a bureaucrat's arsenal. That Washington was gone. By 2025, the men and women who had once populated the resistance, the cautious general counsel, the career scientist who quietly buried a rule change, the inspector general who filed a report no one in the White House would read, had been methodically identified and removed. Project 2025, the conservative policy architecture that Trump had publicly disavowed during the campaign, with the breezy confidence of a man who knows exactly what he is endorsing, had provided the institutional map. The new administration arrived not as tourists but as occupiers who had studied the terrain for years. The Environmental Protection Agency was, in this context, not merely a regulatory body but a symbol, the institutional monument to the proposition that the federal government existed in part to constrain the ambitions of capital in the name of public welfare. Its dismantling was not incidental to Trump's second term. It was, for many of the ideological architects surrounding him, the point. Scott Pruitt had tried in the first term and had been consumed by scandal before he could finish the work. Andrew Wheeler had been steadier, quieter, more methodical. But they had operated within the constraints of a government that still possessed functioning opposition, in Congress, in the courts, in the press. The administrator who now sat in that chair understood that the landscape had shifted. Congressional oversight had grown toothless. Several key committee chairmen had demonstrated in the preceding 2 years that their loyalty to the executive branch exceeded their appetite for constitutional friction. The judiciary remained the last uncertain variable, and even there, the long patient work of the Federalist Society had produced a bench that regarded agency deference to science with the kind of skepticism once reserved for witchcraft. What followed was not a single dramatic act, but a series of quiet demolitions, each one technically defensible, each one moving the structure closer to rubble. The EPA's endangerment finding, the 2009 scientific determination that greenhouse gases pose a threat to public health, and the legal foundation upon which virtually all federal climate regulation rested, had survived Trump's first term largely because the legal exposure of overturning it was considered prohibitive. The Clean Air Act required the agency to regulate pollutants found to endanger health. Eliminate the finding, and you eliminate the legal obligation. The risk, in 2017 and 2018, had been that courts would intervene, that the scientific record was too overwhelming, that the political cost was too high. By 2025, the calculation had changed. The Supreme Court's West Virginia versus EPA decision from 2022 had already curtailed the agency's ability to force broad shifts in electricity generation. A newly configured regulatory posture, not an outright repeal, but a systematic narrowing of the finding's scope, a reframing of the cost-benefit analysis, an elevation of economic harm as a countervailing consideration, began moving through the administrative process with an efficiency that stunned even veteran regulatory lawyers. They understood the paperwork, one former EPA official would later say, with a kind of bleak admiration. In the first term, they wanted to break things. In the second, they wanted to own the means of breaking. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention occupied a different register of the same melody. The CDC's authority rests not in regulatory mandate, but in something more diffuse and therefore more fragile: trust. Its vaccine recommendations do not have the force of law. They operate through a network of institutional deference: physicians who follow ACIP guidelines, insurers who structure coverage around them, schools and employers who translate them into requirements. Undermine the scientific credibility of the recommendations, and the network unravels on its own. Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s arrival at the Department of Health and Human Services as secretary had been, for many in the public health community, a moment of almost theatrical horror. Kennedy was not a fringe figure in the way that phrase is typically understood. He was not a man shouting on a street corner. He was the son of a martyred senator, possessed of a famous name and a lawyer's command of language, capable of deploying the vocabulary of skepticism with a fluency that could sound to the untrained ear like rigor. His objections to vaccine safety consensus were not novel. He had been advancing them for 20 years, but he had always done so from outside the building. Now he was inside it. What followed at the CDC was not a wholesale dismantling of vaccine science, not immediately, not overtly. It was something more surgical, a restructuring of the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, the expert body that makes vaccine recommendations, with new members whose public statements suggested skepticism toward certain vaccine schedules, a redirection of research funding away from established immunization infrastructure toward studies of natural immunity and vaccine injury that critics described as designed to generate predetermined conclusions, a bureaucratic slowdown in the processing of routine recommendation updates that had the practical effect of leaving guidance in limbo during critical seasonal windows. The language shifted. Where the CDC had once published recommendations with the declarative confidence of institutions that consider their authority self-evident, the new communications introduced qualifications, caveats, and what one public health scholar described as strategic ambiguity, phrases constructed to be read as scientifically cautious but that functioned in practice as signals to a population already primed for doubt. Trump himself maintained, throughout this period, a characteristic detachment from the specifics. He had, after all, overseen Operation Warp Speed, the fastest vaccine development program in modern history, and he would invoke that fact with the pride of a man who had built a skyscraper. The achievement was real, the credit was his, and the details of what was being done to the institution that delivered vaccines were someone else's portfolio. He believed in results. He believed in winning. The question of whether long-term institutional erosion constituted winning was not one that occupied him the way it occupied, for instance, Kennedy, or the think tank ideologues who had been waiting decades for precisely this moment. The FDA's transformation was, in some ways, the most complex of the three, because the Food and Drug Administration sits at the intersection of the regulatory state and the market in a way that makes simple ideological narratives difficult to sustain. Deregulation of the FDA is not merely a political project, it is also, for significant portions of the pharmaceutical and biotechnology industries, an economic one. Faster approval pathways mean faster revenue. The tension between freedom from government interference and investor confidence in drug safety is real, and it had historically produced a regulatory equilibrium that was imperfect but functional. The second Trump administration's approach involved an acceleration of expedited review pathways, breakthrough therapy, accelerated approval, fast track, to a degree that alarmed a subset of scientists who argued that the pathways had been designed as exceptions, not as the new standard. The argument on the other side was libertarian in character, that the FDA's caution had, for decades, killed people by denying them access to treatments that might have saved them, that the agency's institutional conservatism was itself a form of harm. This argument had genuine adherents in bioethics and medicine. It also had, conveniently, enormous support among the venture capital funds that had invested heavily in early-stage drug development and stood to profit from abbreviated timelines. It was in this thicket of competing interests that a man named David Weldon, a former congressman and physician, whom Trump had initially nominated to lead the CDC before the nomination stalled, became a recurring figure in White House conversations about health policy architecture. Weldon had testified before Congress years earlier about vaccine safety concerns. His views placed him outside the scientific mainstream. His persistence in the administration's orbit, in formal and informal advisory capacities, illustrated something essential about how Trump consolidated power in the regulatory space. He did not need a single czar with a clear mandate. He needed a distributed network of true believers installed at sufficient depth throughout the bureaucracy that no single personnel decision could be identified as the decisive one. The radicalization was systemic. The accountability was diffuse. What the men with data had not accounted for, sitting in the Roosevelt room that humming morning, was that Trump understood something they did not. In the attention economy that American public life had become, the battle over regulatory science was not won in the Federal Register. It was won in the space between the hearing and the headline, in the confusion generated by competing expert claims, in the exhaustion of a public that had, over 5 years of pandemic and its aftermath, developed a complicated relationship with the phrase, "the science says." The administration did not need to convince Americans that climate change was not real, or that vaccines were dangerous, or that FDA approvals were corrupt. It needed only to expand doubt, to make the question seem open in the minds of enough people that the political cost of defending the old consensus exceeded the political cost of abandoning it. This Trump had understood since long before he entered politics. Uncertainty was a tool. Confusion was a product. And the man who had spent 40 years managing the story of his own failures, transforming Atlantic City bankruptcy into narrative of betrayal, transforming 4 years of chaotic governance into a myth of stolen triumph, was perhaps better equipped than any president in memory to manage the national story about institutions that had failed to heal the country fast enough, regulate fairly enough, or explain themselves clearly enough to a population that had stopped believing them long before he arrived. His associates watched him operate in this period with a mixture of awe and unease. Kennedy, for his part, genuinely believed what he said. His conviction about vaccine safety had been formed over decades and had survived years of scientific refutation with the peculiar durability of ideas that have become identity. He and Trump occupied the same policy space for entirely different reasons, which made their alliance both effective and, in ways neither would have acknowledged, unstable. Kennedy needed Trump to give his mission institutional power. Trump needed Kennedy to give his deregulatory project the credibility of an apparent crusader. Each was using the other. The question of who would eventually use the other more efficiently had not yet been answered. Outside Washington, in the laboratories and public health departments and university research centers that formed the capillary network of American scientific infrastructure, a quiet emergency was being processed. Grant funding was being clawed back. Scientists on federal advisory committees were receiving termination notices by email. The word restructuring was being applied to agencies with the frequency and imprecision of a wrecking ball operator who has been told that only certain walls need to come down but has not been given a map. The walls were coming down. Whether the people inside them had time to get out was a different question, one that the administration, characteristically, had left to the market to resolve. And somewhere in the machinery that was being so carefully taken apart, in the data sets and longitudinal studies and epidemiological models that had been accumulating since the post-war consensus about government's role in public health had first been assembled, there were numbers that no executive order could repeal, numbers describing what happens in the medium term, when the institutions designed to catch certain kinds of catastrophe are no longer looking. Those numbers were patient. They would keep. Chapter 100. The Unitary Executive Legacy. The folder arrived at the Resolute desk on a Tuesday morning in late January 2025, unremarkable in its manila plainness, the kind of thing that passes through a presidency by the hundreds each week. But this one did not pass through. Trump lifted it, held it with both hands, and stared at the cover sheet bearing the seal of the Department of Justice. Those in the room that morning, and there were always people in the room, later recalled that he said nothing for nearly 30 seconds, which in Trump's presence was a geological age. Then he set it down, smoothed it with his palm, as if pressing something permanently into the surface of history, and looked up. This, he said, to no one in particular, is what winning looks like. The folder contained the draft framework for what his legal architects had quietly named the Consolidation Directives, a series of executive orders, recess appointments, and agency restructuring memos that, taken individually, might have appeared to be the ordinary machinery of a new administration finding its footing. Taken together, they constituted something that constitutional scholars, once they had time to excavate the full architecture, would argue had no precise precedent in American history. The directives proposed to relocate significant interpretive authority over regulatory enforcement directly into the White House, bypassing the traditional independence of agencies that had operated for decades with a deliberate distance from presidential instruction. It was, in the language of the theory that had animated a generation of conservative legal thinkers, the unitary executive doctrine, the belief that Article 2 of the Constitution vests all executive power in the president alone, carried further toward its logical conclusion than any administration had ever dared. The world into which these directives arrived was one already humming with ideological electricity. The 2024 election had not merely returned Trump to the presidency, it had delivered him unified Republican control of Congress for a crucial opening window, a Supreme Court whose philosophical majority he had personally shaped across 2 terms, and a conservative legal movement that had spent 30 years building the intellectual scaffolding for exactly this moment. The Federalist Society's long, patient project, placing originalist and textualist judges throughout the federal judiciary, cultivating a constitutional theory that pushed back against the administrative state, had, by January 2025, produced a structural environment in which the unitary executive theory was no longer an academic position but an operational one. Outside the White House gates, the country remained fractured. Inflation had stabilized, but not disappeared from the lived experience of working Americans. Public trust in federal institutions hovered near historic lows. And the Democratic Party, still processing the psychological wreckage of a second consecutive loss to the same man, had not yet coalesced around a coherent opposition to the structural changes already underway. The moment, in other words, belonged entirely to Donald Trump, and he knew how to read a moment. The core conflict of this period was not primarily partisan, though it wore partisan clothing. It was constitutional, a genuine, generational dispute over the nature of the American administrative state, and the degree to which a single elected official could legally direct, discipline, or dismantle the sprawling bureaucratic apparatus that had grown up over a century of legislative expansion. Trump's opponents framed the question in terms of democratic erosion. His defenders framed it in terms of democratic accountability. Why should unelected bureaucrats, insulated by civil service protections and operating under vague statutory delegations, be beyond the reach of the official whom the American people had actually chosen? Both framings contained truth, which is precisely what made the conflict so combustible. The obstacle Trump faced was not a political enemy or a resistant Congress. Those could be managed, negotiated, or overrun. The obstacle was the institutional architecture of the American Republic itself, 230 years of accumulated precedent, custom, and legal interpretation, most of it designed with the explicit intention of distributing rather than concentrating executive authority. What made this struggle different from the frustrations of his first term was that Trump had learned. The man who returned to the Oval Office in January 2025 had absorbed, through years of post-presidential brooding and through the counsel of a new generation of advisors far more legally sophisticated than those who had peopled his first administration, a crucial lesson that the resistance he had encountered between 2017 and 2021 had not come primarily from Democrats or from the press. It had come from inside. From officials who slow-walked his orders. From agency counsel who raised legal objections. From career staff who understood that the machinery of the administrative state could be used to outlast any individual president if the career staff simply waited long enough. He would not make that mistake again. The revealing action came in April 2025, and it arrived in a form so deliberately unremarkable that its significance was initially underestimated even by those who should have known better. Trump signed an executive order expanding the scope of Schedule F, a classification category first created near the end of his first term and rescinded by Biden on his first day, to cover tens of thousands of federal employees in policy-adjacent roles, rendering them removable at will rather than protected by civil service tenure. The order was not accompanied by fanfare. There was no Rose Garden ceremony, no primetime address. It was released on a late Friday afternoon, slipped into the public record the way you might slide a letter under a door. The understatement was itself the signal. In his first term, Trump had reached for spectacle instinctively, often to his own detriment, drawing attention to actions that might otherwise have passed with less mobilized opposition. Now, the calculation was different. The Schedule F expansion was not designed to generate a news cycle. It was designed to reshape the permanent government of the United States, and it worked best in the quiet. When a reporter from the Washington Post pressed a senior White House official about the scope of the order, how many employees could ultimately be affected, what appeals processes would remain available, what standards would govern who was reclassified, the official smiled in a way that did not reach his eyes, and said the administration was simply restoring accountability to a government that had forgotten it worked for the American people. The phrase had been road-tested. It had the smooth, frictionless quality of language that has been polished by many hands. Trump himself, asked about the order during a brief exchange with reporters on the South Lawn, was characteristically direct in the way that obscures as much as it reveals. "We're cleaning it up," he said. "You had a lot of people in there who were never going to do what needed to be done. They were never going to do it. Now they will, or they'll go." The figure who most shaped the administrative consolidation of this period, and whose influence over Trump's second-term constitutional project was quietly decisive, was not a cabinet secretary or a congressional ally, but a lawyer, a precise, methodical, largely media-averse legal strategist whose name appeared infrequently in newspaper profiles, but whose fingerprints were on nearly every significant structural document produced by the administration in its first 18 months. This was the generation of legal talent that had grown up in the Federalist Society's orbit, deeply versed in the theoretical literature of the unitary executive, true believers not in Trump the personality, but in Trump the vehicle, the rare political figure willing to carry their constitutional project to its operational limit. The relationship between Trump and these architects was symbiotic in the way of all successful patron-ideologue partnerships. He gave them the power to act, and they gave him the legal architecture to act within something he could present as constitutional principle rather than personal appetite. As 2025 matured into 2026, and the first court challenges to the consolidation directives began working their way through the federal judiciary, this relationship solidified into something resembling mutual dependence. Trump needed their briefs. They needed his nerve. What the courts would ultimately do with the unitary executive project remained through 2026 genuinely uncertain, which was itself a testament to how far the legal center of gravity had shifted in 30 years. Challenges that would once have seemed straightforward, cases in which the independence of regulatory agencies had appeared to be a settled constitutional assumption, now arrived before judges operating in an intellectual environment transformed by decades of originalist scholarship and appointments. The major questions doctrine, the non-delegation doctrine, the limits of Chevron deference before its erosion, these were no longer rarefied academic debates. They were live ammunition in a constitutional war being waged in real time in courtrooms from Washington to the Fifth Circuit, with the shape of American government hanging in the balance. Trump, who had never been a man of legal theory, and who consumed constitutional doctrine the way he consumed most information, in summaries, in confident assertions from trusted advisors, in outcomes rather than processes, showed no visible anxiety about the litigation. He had, by this stage of his life, a nearly geological confidence in his own position that was partly temperamental and partly strategic. Anxiety was something to be displayed only when it served a purpose. What he understood, viscerally and correctly, was that the act of implementing, of actually reorganizing agencies, actually reclassifying employees, actually issuing directives that executive departments began actually following, created facts on the ground that were far more durable than any court calendar. Legal challenges moved slowly. Structural changes, once embedded in the bureaucratic reality of the federal government, were extraordinarily difficult to reverse even when the courts eventually weighed in. He had learned this, too, from the years of watching his first-term initiatives survive challenges, not because they were legally unassailable, but because the machinery of implementation had moved faster than the machinery of objection. By the middle of 2026, with midterm elections beginning to loom at the edge of the political horizon, the constitutional reckoning was entering its second phase. The first phase had been implementation, rapid, deliberate, strategically quiet. The second phase was consolidation in the deeper sense, the embedding of the new administrative reality into the expectations and behaviors of the federal workforce, the regulated industries, and the oversight institutions that had once checked executive power through norms as much as through law. Norms were the invisible infrastructure of democratic governance, the unwritten agreements about how power would be restrained even when it technically need not be. Trump had always been indifferent to norms, not out of malice, but out of a genuinely different conception of what they were, obstacles mostly, invented by people who had something to protect in the existing arrangement. His supporters had elected him precisely to break them. His opponents feared him precisely because he was succeeding. The assessment that began to take shape among constitutional scholars in this period was carefully hedged, as careful scholars always hedge, but its underlying conclusion carried a weight that hedging could not entirely muffle. The second term of Donald Trump had produced the most significant restructuring of executive power in the post-New Deal era. Whether that restructuring was a restoration of the Constitution's original design or a dangerous concentration of authority in a single office was a question that would be argued for a generation. What was not arguable was that it had happened, that it was real, and that it had been accomplished with a methodical patience, a willingness to use legal architecture, appointment strategy, and the slow pressure of institutional change rather than dramatic confrontation that bore almost no resemblance to the chaotic improvisations of the first term. The man at the center of it had aged into his power in the way that certain men do, hardened rather than softened by time, the rough edges not smoothed but weaponized. He sat at the resolute desk with the settled authority of someone who had finally brought the room to heel. He had wanted this. Not precisely this, perhaps, not the legal scaffolding or the regulatory doctrine or the constitutional theory, but the feeling underneath it, the feeling of the machinery moving when he pushed. For most of his first term, the machinery had resisted. Now it moved. Somewhere in the federal judiciary, a three-judge panel was preparing to hear arguments in a case that would test, for the first time at the appellate level, whether the most expansive of the consolidation directives could withstand scrutiny. And in chambers that Trump had himself helped fill, the outcome was not as predictable as either side wished to believe. You have reached the conclusion of Donald Trump, master of the medium and American power. Through 10 extensive chapters, this volume has clinically examined the structural, economic, and media strategies used to project and consolidate executive power in the modern era. From his early management training in Brooklyn and Queens to the complex public-private partnerships of Manhattan, and finally to the historic administrative restructuring, infrastructure initiatives, and legislative tax overhauls of his second presidency, this text has aimed to provide an indispensable single-volume reference for historians, political analysts, and citizens alike. Thank you for purchasing and listening to this independent audiobook production. For more resources or to explore additional formats of this title, please check your digital library dashboard or point of purchase. This concludes the audio presentation.